Ronald the Rules Lawyer. The new D&D edition is out, and they want you to lock in your pre-orders now to get a discount on the bundle of books. The Monster Manual releases in 6 months, and this $180 price costs less than if you were to wait, because they announced this last year, that digital physical bundle prices for individual books are going up to $70. Before this video, I did a companion video about how you can save significant money going with another system, whether that's Pathfinder or some of the other ones I mentioned in that video. In this video, I handle Hasbro's handling of the revision itself. They have now lifted the embargo, and now we can finally see what changes to core rules and spells, which were the most important things to me looking at the revision process, they are actually implementing, which we hardly saw any of during the so-called playtest process that started 2 years ago. In today's video, I hone in on those things that jumped out at me from what I've seen, and I think they show a lack of regard toward dungeon masters and toward players who prefer martial characters, and a lack of quality control. And in my final thoughts section, I will give general observations about what these details that jumped out at me show me about the direction Wizards of the Coast is probably going in. Before going into negatives, I'm going to acknowledge that there is a large number of smaller improvements in the new edition. Weapon masteries give martial players more interesting things to do with their characters and during their turn. And thank goodness the bonus action casting rule has been replaced. Now it's a simple rule that you cannot cast more than one leveled spell slot during your turn. However, I would argue that they're band-aids to long-standing issues in the system that especially dungeon masters and those who are looking for a more functional system have been raising for years. This is one of my longer videos, so I'm going to point to timestamps if you want to jump to what you're looking for. Before I get into the negatives, I need to clarify some things. First is full disclosure. I am Ronald the Rules Lawyer, and I'm a primarily Pathfinder 2e channel, and I'm on record calling for a continued boycott of Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro. But I believe that my opinions and the evidence I present stand on their own, and you, of course, can make your own independent judgment. And the point I'll make in this video about lack of regard for dungeon masters is echoed by one of the major D&D creators in the YouTube space. Now, I'm going to apologize for the extended clip, but I'm going to include it here to stave off accusations that I am saying these things simply because I'm a non-D&D player. Sly Flourish is a very well-regarded D&D creator who has authored books, the Lazy Dungeon Masters books, that have helped lots of D&D DMs. He's about to direct quote something from one of WOTC's promotional materials that shows disregard for dungeon masters.
Here was a quote that they posted on the D&D Beyond site. This is one of those where I read this and I was really mad, right? I was kind of insulted. And I was like, what the hell are you even doing? The fact that you said this makes me upset, right? These are the devious strikes. Now, granted, level 14, and at level 14, things are already gone. So I've only had a couple of campaigns that reach level 14 anyway. So I'm not getting really upset about the specific ability, but I am upset about this statement. Days, who says a support build can also deal damage? If your target fails a constitution saving throw, they'll only get to move or take an action or bonus action on their next turn. Frustrating for dungeon masters, but fantastic for your party. Are you kidding me? Like, I saw that and I'm like, who are you making this game for? Why would I run this? If you're telling me, oh, we built things in here that are designed to be frustrating for dungeon masters, or we knew it was frustrating for dungeon masters, but we went ahead anyway, you're not advocating for DMs. And I don't think, maybe you figured out some new way that players can play without a DM, but why would I do that? I would just go downstairs and play Destiny 2. Why do I need to run a game that's specifically designed to be frustrating for dungeon masters? And I'm like, when you say monsters are going to hate it, who do you actually mean? Because monsters don't hate anybody. They're not real. The monster is a stat block sitting on a page. But somebody's running that monster. And this is where you get into like video game mentality. And the human being wants to see monsters behaving and having the abilities and the effects that we expect the story to support. And that can't happen if they're like, oh, they're at disadvantage the whole time. It feels like they know this. Right? 3 instances in the last week alone. 1, frustrating for dungeon masters, but fantastic for your party. 2, hey, which one of these different golf clubs am I going to use to knock down this monster? 3, monsters are going to hate when they're at disadvantage to attack the warlock, but also they're at disadvantage to attack anybody that isn't the warlock. Those are all instances where it feels like a DM advocate could be like, what do DMs feel about this? Right? Is that what we want? And who should we be considering because we're the one that runs the game. They gave players a whole bunch of new toys. What new toys is the GM getting? Do I want new toys? Not really, because my job is to make the game run smooth and fast and give everybody good spotlight time so that they can show off their abilities. I was like on board until I read this. This is the thing that really set me off. Frustrating for Dungeon Masters. If this were any other game, I'd be like, yeah, I'm not even reading anything else. I'm not going to look at anything else you're doing. I'm done. Right? If you ever tell me that something is in the game that's going to be frustrating for Dungeon Masters, I don't know who you're aiming it for. Because I'm the one that runs the games. I'm the one that sets them up. I'm the one that schedules them. I'm the one that's make sure we have a place to go. I've spent probably 100 to 1,000 times more money on the game than many of my players have. Now, I actually have lots of players who are DMs themselves. They've certainly got a big investment in this. Oh, man.
So that's my first preface before I get into the negatives. Second is I am speaking from the Dungeon Master's perspective. I am a partisan for Dungeon Masters. Players are the vast majority of the D&D community, but it's the DM who runs the game and makes the game possible. No DM, no game. And I'm not going to be focusing in this video on character abilities or the things that most people are talking about, raving about, or ranting about right now. Much of WOTC's hype for the new edition is focused on player characters getting new toys, but I am approaching this from a completely different perspective. When I see a change, I'm asking myself, what problem or issue is this addressing? What is it addressing one of the long-standing issues that many players and DMs have been saying about D&D? There are many such issues, and for this particular video, I'm going to be focusing on lack of support for DMs, making combat more engaging and fun, and martial characters feeling overshadowed by their caster counterparts. My last preface is that I'm not attributing malice to any member of D&D's design team. I think the problem is rooted in mismanagement by the executives. There are two parts to this. First, there was a commitment to backwards compatibility to the previous edition that I think, in reality, the vast majority of players and DMs did not want. People talk about bloat in 5e, and I think people would have been happy with resetting their system and or having changes to the base rules that would clearly improve the game for everyone, especially Dungeon Masters. And I think what we got was more like having band-aids on old problems. The second mismanagement issue was they slashed their design staff in 2023. Which means that those band-aids that were placed were not placed well. Some were put on places that arguably did not need them, and some wounds were ignored or, in some cases, exacerbated, had salt poured into them. We'll see some of those examples in this video. Hasbro cut its overall staff by 20%, and this included many of their designers. In summer of last year at Gen Con, they were talking about having at least 10 playtests that would include Dungeon Master's Guide and Monster Manual playtests. Those playtests never happened. One last preface, which is that I don't have a copy of the new Player's Handbook. I've done my due diligence looking at other creators' work, mostly of TreantMonk, laser focused on the spells changes and the core rules changes that are what I'm looking for in the Player's Handbook to see whether Hasbro is addressing the problems I'm identifying. My main source today are TreantMonk's coverage so far of the new edition. He goes into the text, and a lot of the screenshots I'll show today are taken from his videos. I also, of course, followed the Unearthed Arcana process the last couple of years and did a whole series of videos with thoughts on those. There's a link to my playtest in the description. My other source are the discussions I've had with many knowledgeable people in my Discord. We have a channel devoted to discussing the new edition of D&D. If you want to join us, join my Discord, link in the description, and give yourself the role called Other Gaming. All right, we finally get into the meat. And my first point I'll make is that this new edition shows an unserious effort to rebalance spells. There's a well-known issue of a disparity between the power of casters and marshals in D&D. TreantMonk says that much of that issue is in the spells themselves, and a minority of spells that are very powerful that can unbalance the game. Admittedly, he has a higher tolerance than I do for casters having a lot of power, but even he's identifying that there are a number of spells that should be reined in. And in his videos covering the spells changes in detail, he has a number of things he praises there's a number of positive changes, but also he has a lot of criticisms. And many of them include issues that he himself has brought up on his channel in the past, often more than once, but which WOTC didn't seem to even identify as issues. And I recommend his channel, by the way, if you're looking for in-depth analysis of D&D. With regard to WOTC, he is more of a glass half full person than I am. I am more of a glass half empty person when it comes to WOTC. But if you're looking for rules analysis, his channel is really good for that. But yeah, looking at his spell breakdowns, one gets the strong impression that Wizards of the Coast did not put in a fully serious effort. There are buffs to spells that did not need buffing, that were already strong. Sometimes nerfs to spells that were considered weak. Sure, there were nerfs to some strong spells, but they didn't go as far as they needed to. And there are also mechanical inconsistencies that have been introduced in some of the new spells, which we'll see. It just, to me, comes off as a mediocre effort by a billion-dollar company that captures the vast majority of TTRPG players that it shouldn't be getting away with. So my first example is the Force Cage spell. This was and is a very strong spell, too strong, I would say. It's a 7th level spell, but it's an encounter winner and a boss killer. It creates an invulnerable cube 20 feet on a side that any non-spellcasting opponent has no counter to. It does not call for a saving throw. They have no chance of avoiding it, and it doesn't even call for concentration. There's nothing one can do to end this spell unless you have a mage in your party to cast Disintegrate, and you need to have teleportation yourself to escape this cube. So if you're not a spellcaster or have magical abilities, you're screwed. Well, here's a new version of Force Cage. It makes the 1500 gold material component consumed when you cast the spell. And it makes the spell disruptible by making it require your concentration. It makes no other changes. These changes are welcome, but not enough. The gold cost basically relies on the game master to make a compelling gold economy for your system, and this game does not provide prices for magic items still. And that's something that competing companies have created for 5e through Tales of the Valiant and Level Up Advanced 5th Edition. And it doesn't sound like, at the time of this video, they are introducing prices, given that their promotional materials, including a video about the Dungeon Master's Guide, make no mention of prices. So it doesn't address the central problem of any party worth their salt is going to save the money, 1,500 gold, to cast Force Cage against important story boss creatures. And let's just say that there's at least one published adventure out there where you take on a dragon, and it might even be the ending boss of a campaign, and Force Cage completely neutralizes that boss. Of course, a resourceful party is going to save money for casting Force Cage. Okay, but it requires concentration now. But, well, there are ways to avoid breaking concentration that are quite effective in this game. One of them being just stand around the corner. This has a range of 100 feet. You can be a wizard that steps out, casts Force Cage from a long distance, and then goes back around the corner. They can't do anything to you since they can't move after all. Now, some would say, well, give the boss minions that can cast spells and help their leader. And I would say that's an example of a band-aid for a problem that shouldn't exist in the first place. And we know this doesn't have to exist because we can look at another company and what they did to Force Cage 15 years ago. And I'm not going to name names because I don't want to be accused of bias, but okay, let's just say it's a company that revised 3rd edition D&D's version of Force Cage. It was still a super powerful spell, but they at least allowed the target to do a saving throw, and they also gave statistics to the cage so that somebody caught in it can still destroy it. You don't need magic to destroy it, and it really exacerbates the martial caster divide to give martial characters no counter to a magical effect that neutralizes them completely. It didn't require much effort here to look up what another company did 15 years ago to solve this problem, and which I'm sure has been brought up in online D&D forums over the past 10 years when talking about Force Cage now and in the lead up to this new edition. The next example, I think, shows a only partial effort to clarify the system and make it more internally consistent. It's supposed to be a rules improvement, but they didn't universally apply it. And what it is that there are several spells that create an aura that harms enemies who are in the aura. And here's the old version of Spirit Guardians, the cleric spell that does radiant damage. It currently affects a creature who enters the area for the first time on a turn. So let's say one of your allies pushes a foe into your aura. They immediately need to make a saving throw to lessen this radiant damage they've just been exposed to. But they then immediately have to make a saving throw again when their turn starts. That had the perhaps unintended effect of exposing a creature twice to your spell without them being able to do anything in between. Well, the revised Spirit Guardians seeks to correct that. The second saving throw in my scenario happens when the creature ends their turn in the area, so they can leave the area. TreantMonk reports that they've made this change to a number of aura effects coming from spells, and to me it sounds like a welcome change. However, let's look at the new web spell, which already was a strong spell in D&D, which makes creatures in a 20-foot cube restrained if they're caught in it if they fail a dexterity saving throw. Before, they had to save against the web only during their own turn. But they buff it so that they can be affected if they are pushed into it outside their turn, just like with Spirit Guardians. However, they have to make their next saving throw at the start of their own turn. So the problem that was supposedly eliminated for Spirit Guardians has now been introduced for Web, which is arguably a stronger spell because it can, if you're a melee monster, because it can lock you in place. We see the same issue with the new Conjure Elemental spell. This is another strong spell that creates an intangible spirit in the battlefield that does 8d8 damage and can restrain a foe who fails their saving throw. The way they wrote this, you can force a creature to have to save against it twice and be exposed to its damage twice by pushing them into it outside of their turn, because their next saving throw is at the start of their turn. The language that they avoided with Spirit Guardians. It's just very slapdash. The next spell is considered very strong, called Hideous Laughter. Calls for a wisdom saving throw. It's a first level spell that basically incapacitates a foe and forces them to ha 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 on the ground. They're prone. So all attacks within 5 feet have advantage against them. A very strong spell. It was curbed by the fact that it could only have one target. It couldn't be heightened. And it required that the target have an intelligence score of 4 or higher, or else they won't get your joke. Well, they have buffed this very strong spell. There no longer is an intelligence requirement, and you can heighten the spell to add 1 additional creature for every single spell slot above 1. So you can spend a 5th level spell slot on this to incapacitate 5 creatures. The next examples show a mechanical inconsistency which have bizarre results that seem unintended. Here is Ray of Enfeeblement. You shoot energy that is supposed to weaken a foe. If they fail their saving throw, they get disadvantage on all strength-based checks, including attacks that are based on strength. They also do less damage. It's a concentration spell up to 1 minute, but they get a new saving throw at the end of each of their turns. If they succeed on their saving throw, they get disadvantage on their next attack roll until the start of your next turn. There are some foes who do not have strength-based attacks in D&D. They have dexterity-based attacks. So if you attack that Drow warrior with Ray of Enfeeblement, they're actually worse off if they succeed on their saving throw, because the success result doesn't care, gives disadvantage regardless of whether their attack is strength-based. So that's strange and unintended, I'm sure. And there's a similar issue with Otto's Irresistible Dance, the 6th level spell that makes somebody dance. On a failed saving throw, they become charmed and dance in place and get these other disadvantages. But when they're charmed, they cannot attack you. But it says all of these negative effects happen while they are charmed. There are creatures that are immune to being charmed in D&D. Meanwhile, succeeding against this spell means you dance in place regardless of whether you are immune to the charmed condition. So if you happen to be immune to charmed, you actually want to fail your saving throw against this spell to avoid its effects. So that's sloppy. Now, I've seen rules mistakes from Paizo that are similar to these errors here. However, those were all for spells that they were making brand new for the edition. At least all the ones I can think of. And it's strange for these errors to be made to spells that existed decades in D&D and existed in 5e since 10 years ago, and which there has been feedback from the community for the past 10 years. And they just had a playtest where they actually didn't playtest these spells, and they would have solved these issues had they playtested them during the playtest process. The next thing I'll address is the Band-Aid approach to high CR, high challenge rating monsters. It is well known that D&D breaks down at higher levels, past, say, level 10. And one way of addressing that problem would be redesigning higher CR creatures to provide better tools to DMs to challenge their parties, and in some cases just provide a challenge, period. We know that the announced plan of a monster manual playtest never happened, and it won't happen. But more than that, we never saw in the playtest any real effort to address high-level play in D&D. There was nothing in the surveys or any of the communications throughout the whole quote-unquote playtest indicating that they were trying to or were even interested in addressing issues with high-level D&D. One large reason high-level play breaks down is save or suck effects. They used to be called save or die effects, but they were toned down with 5th edition, at least compared to 3rd edition. High-level 3rd edition play devolved into what was often called a rocket tag, the side that won initiative would win the battle because their abilities that they would bring onto the field were so powerful and could shut down the other side. 4th edition addressed save or suck effects with a mixed reaction, and 5th edition wanted to avoid looking like 4th edition, so we got what we got. They kept save or suck effects in the system. They toned them down slightly, but they still could single-handedly win encounters, like the web spell, for example, or hypnotic pattern. While the designers of 5e did not want a single spell to shut down a big villain that you've built up in your campaign. And we know what they did. Those of you who play 5e know what I'm about to say. They introduced legendary resistances. There are many higher CR creatures that are meant to be story encounters, like bosses, who have this ability that when they would fail a saving throw, they get to choose to succeed instead. And if anything can be called a band-aid in the system, this definitely is probably the poster child for that. Instead of addressing the underlying math, what we now have is DMs now needing to tell the caster player, you succeeded, except you don't because I have a legendary resistance. And it leads to feels bad moments for the casters. And also it leads to combats that can kind of feel like a slog. It's like an artificial timer placed on a combat that makes this monster that everyone knows you're going to defeat stick around a little longer. And it leads to this strange meta where you're using weaker spells that call for saving throws that you also want to be strong enough to make the creature want to use one of their legendary resistances. And we all know that this did not fully succeed. There are still creatures that, like the Tarrasque, the CR30 Tarrasque, who has a +0 dexterity saving throw, who can be defeated with a low-level web spell and held in place with no counter. Because of the math behind how saving throws worked, there's bound to be a chink in their saving throw armor. So if they have a good dexterity save, web won't work, but maybe you can do hypnotic pattern. Or if they're good against both spells, then find another spell that targets, say, charisma, like banishment. So now that they were working on this new edition, one would think they would try to plug up the math at least. Maybe allow saving throws to advance for higher CR creatures. And there's a similar problem for player characters, by the way. Martial characters can have weak mental saves going into the high levels, which makes them susceptible to a dragon's frightful aura, for example. Maybe some of that underlying math that caused these problems, undeniable problems, could be addressed, but they didn't do that. Another possible solution was making the CR rating matter more, making level differences matter more. So maybe if you're a level 5 PC casting web against a CR30 Tarrasque, maybe your lack of spellcasting experience means your webs are less effective holding this mythical legendary creature. Older editions had spells only affect creatures with a certain number of hit dice, for example. Maybe something like that could have been implemented. So here's the new Ancient Green Dragon. What did they do? They made it so that they have 4 legendary resistances instead of 3. And if they're in their lair, they have 5. So it's not addressing the problems that this Band-Aid was created to address. And it puts a Band-Aid on the Band-Aid itself. And we know also that this new dragon is still defeated with the new Force Cage spell, which doesn't call for a saving throw. Legendary resistance has no answer to that. Another change they made is they gave it 3 reactions per round that they can only use once per turn. And while they're in their lair, they can make a 4th reaction per round. And to this, I don't have any objection on principle to that. It's a little immersion breaking, but there are many games, including many video games, that give different mechanics for creatures that are solo boss creatures, that give them more actions. I've played XCOM 2, and I know. So my objection is not there, it's on this. One of their reactions is Charming Presence. They can cast Charm Monster, which is an at-will spell for them. And Charm Monster calls for a Wisdom save. And so if you have martial characters in your party who before, versus the previous version of the Green Dragon, would have been shut down by the Frightful Presence ability, they're now going to be shut down by this Charm Monster ability. The spell save DC is 21. Now, if you're a martial character with the Wisdom saving throw of +0, you are kind of screwed here. You can't succeed against that. And before, against Frightful Presence, you at least could have your party cast Hero's Feast, which gives you immunity to the Frightened condition. But all that spell does versus charm effects is give you advantage on Wisdom saving throws, like this one. And even with advantage, you mathematically cannot succeed on your saving throw with the +0 because you can't get it high enough. And a natural 20 on a saving throw in 5e does not automatically succeed, unlike in previous editions. I believe it's the first edition where a nat 20 does not auto-succeed on a saving throw, and they've kept that with 5.5e. They've just neglected the underlying math of the system. So we've now seen more than one thing that creates this martial caster divide in D&D. If someone casts Force Cage on your fighter, they have no counter. And if you're facing a Green Dragon of either edition, you have no counter without magical assistance. Now, I'm not saying D&D needs to take the path of 4e or Pathfinder 2e of creating casters and martials at a much more equal level. I'm just saying that the new D&D should have done something to address the fact that martials are sometimes shut down because they're a martial. This all kind of leads into the third point, which is that they did not change problematic rules for DMs to create fun, balanced, challenging encounters. Ones that lead to what I'll call a feast or famine problem for tables. For example, they did not change the frightened condition, which can take a creature out of a battle entirely if they are a melee martial. And even if they're not, can be very debilitating. Frightened was also suffered disproportionately by martial characters who tended to have poor mental saving throws. And these problems were baked into this base rule. And many higher CR monsters in D&D impose the frightened condition. And so this makes it very impactful in higher level play. That's why many parties then cast the Hero's Feast spell to gain immunity from this condition. It avoided the problem by eliminating it being relevant entirely. And that is arguably a band-aid. It was giving immunity to a condition because of how busted the condition was. And it creates another problem. You have now eliminated its importance in the game and eliminated something distinctive about the monsters that impose the frightened condition. It makes those monsters in higher level play more bland if you can counter these abilities like this. So I think that illustrates the feast or famine problem. Either you are screwed or you win with these abilities that often crop up in higher level play. Save or suck effects. It makes it a real challenge for dungeon masters to balance encounters This thing can be really impactful until it's not, in which case it becomes irrelevant and means nothing. It kind of reduces higher level play to simply a game of neutralizing the worst contingencies. And once you do, it becomes a boring hit point fest. I'll put a video on the screen about how status effects are very important to making more interesting decisions in combat. Another obvious problem with this condition is that it takes agency away, and many martial players imagine their characters to be heroes who face danger, and this doesn't let them make a choice. So I think there is a missed opportunity here to revisit the frightened condition. And it doesn't have to be this way. There are other tabletop role-playing games that do frightened differently. This is from Draw Steel, formerly called MCDM RPG by Matt Colville's company. When you are frightened, attacks you make against the Sorth suffer a bane. They have a penalty of 1d4. And attacks that source make against you have a boon. They have a 1d4 bonus. Pathfinder 2e just subtracts a value equal to the frightened condition from all of your checks and your DCs, including your armor class. And it ticks down by 1 at the end of your turn. The advantage of both of these versions that are not D&D is they let you fight through your fear. And that's a heroic story that should be told more. I can't be fully comprehensive, but there are other rules that they just didn't revisit, which could have been revisited, with little disruption to backwards compatibility even. All right, the next point I'll make is that stealth rules are still janky as hell. In 5e, they were confusing and unhelpful, and they still are, but in a different way. I'm going to remind people who wanted to forget about this that in 2021, lead rules designer for D&D, Jeremy Crawford, came out with a ruling that has been lambasted by the community, saying that the see invisibility spell doesn't actually let you fully see invisible creatures. You still have disadvantage attacking them. And this was only one issue with the stealth and awareness rules, which are related. And in this new edition, they attempt to address at least this concern, but the end totality is still confusing. So confusing, in fact, that the D&D subreddits have had long posts trying to make sense of them. Here's one of them, and here's the other one. Not short at all. There. Oh, there. There. So what are the new rules? Well, here's the rule for hide. It's now a flat DC of 15 to do a stealth check to conceal yourself. You need to have 3/4 cover or better, or be heavily obscured. It also says you must be out of any enemy's line of sight. Now, those who know game rules, well, I'm not trying to be insulting. People familiar with other games know that line of sight means some kind of line can be drawn between you and the foe, and it's not blocked by darkness or a fog effect. So reading this so far, it sounds like you have to be completely around the corner or unable to see your foe. However, the rest of the sentence says, if you can see a creature, you can discern whether it can see you. What they actually mean by line of sight is not what we're used to line of sight meaning. It means whether they notice you, whether they currently see you, let's say. That's what this means, because you can see them after all, but they can't see you right now. And I would argue that this term line of sight adds nothing but confusion. All right, next. On a successful check, you have the invisible condition. Okay, most people hear the word invisible and think that you are transparent, that people can look through you. But that's not what invisible means here. This is unintuitive and bizarre language because you're not actually invisible the way we all use this word. Instead, when you hide, you become hidden. Why don't we use that word? Or maybe if we're talking about whether they can see you, you become unseen. That would be the better word for this condition. There are many ways to become hidden, and invisibility is only one of several ways to do that. But they're naming the condition after the method and not after the condition. The condition of being unseen. So we're now going to have game tables where somebody says, I'm invisible, so I get advantage on my initiative roll. And then the DM later maybe ignores that character because they thought they were invisible. And the player corrects the DM and says, no, I wasn't invisible. I had the invisible condition. D&D has often been criticized for its the designers call natural language, which critics say means that they avoid clarity in their rules and leave interpretation up to the dungeon master, the beleaguered dungeon master. The criticism says that D&D should have more key words to make rules presentation clearer. And here we have the one key word we have for the stealth rules is a misnomer. Okay, so when does the invisible condition ends? It says, well, first of all, until a creature finds you with a wisdom perception check, which this is actually TreantMonk's addition with the search action. He had to insert that there to give clarity that wasn't there. But in addition, you lose the invisible condition. And we have to say invisible condition because you're also not invisible. You lose the condition when you make a sound louder than a whisper, an enemy finds you, you make an attack roll, or you cast a spell with a verbal component. What's not mentioned here or addressed, there's no answer to the question, what if you move? What if you move out of your current spot? In 5e, in the 2014 book, we had this language that said that after you hide, most creatures stay alert for signs of danger all around, so if you come out of hiding and approach a creature, it usually sees you. After a long analysis, one of the subreddit threads says that is not true. However, it took a lot of searching in different parts of the book. Speaking of movement, we all know that one of the goals of hiding is to lose the enemy. You want them to not know where you are. And there's a question of what you gain from hiding, because after all, they didn't see you before you started hiding. So what did you gain? Well, apparently you made them lose your location. However, why then does the invisible condition say that they can target you, but with disadvantage on their attack roll? Apparently they do know your location. Maybe there's another check to make. Now that Reddit posts seem to figure things out, however, it had to look in 5 different parts of the book to do so. They also say that yes, you can approach a creature after you hide against the passive perception DC of the foe, and because it's considered favorable circumstances for that foe, it's as if they had advantage, and the book says that if a foe has advantage, their passive DC is increased by 5, and so you need to defeat their passive perception DC plus 5. But that took a lot of rules analysis and was not spelled out. And it's frankly mind-boggling that the rules for hiding in the system continue to be in a completely different chapter from the hide action, as in the 2014 book. You want those rules to be together, and they usually are together in systems that are accused of being harder to understand and more complex than D&D. All right, let's look at the invisible condition, and again, I take issue with the name. You're actually hidden or unseen. It says, you aren't affected by any effect that requires its target to be seen unless the effect's creator can somehow see you. Now, this language is here probably to fix the problem from the Jeremy Crawford ruling. This says that if you have magical invisibility, they can have an effect that lets them see you, like see invisibility. But it's just confusing that they use this rule to do double duty to describe mundane hiding, where this text is less appropriate. If you're a rogue that's not using magic and who's just being stealthy, hiding behind a desk, you can see the foe and they can see you if they make an effort to notice you. It's not that they can't see you, it's just that they don't see you right now. This can lead to confusion. They should have just made this condition unseen or hidden and create another condition called invisible that says you are unseen or hidden, and then say it has no effect on a foe who can ignore your invisibility. Okay, in another part of the book, we learned that the search action can be used with a perception check to find a concealed creature or object. So this clearly relates to a creature who hides to make themselves concealed. The word concealed is in the hide action. If they had chosen more intuitive language for the condition, they could have said unseen creature here or hidden creature, but they couldn't. But I'm looking at this now for a different reason, which is that it takes your whole damn action to find a creature who hid from you, and it took your whole damn action to hide from a foe. And is that an action economy we want? You might expect me to now point to Pathfinder 2e, where you can hide and attack on the same turn, but I'm not. I'm going to look at DC 20 RPG, which just had its Kickstarter, a successful one. There you have 4 action points, and hiding only costs 1 of those points. So you can make an attack on the same turn you hid and gain the advantages on your turn. And they also clearly delineate simply being unseen, which being invisible can make you unseen, and losing the enemy. DC 20 calls that the hidden condition. Your location is unknown to creatures you're hidden from. And what makes you hidden? Surprise, surprise, the hide action makes you hidden. And so using this hide action, it makes it explicitly clear that they lose you, they lose your location, and that in turn makes you both unseen and unheard. So what these rules, these new stealth rules do is something kind of common in D&D, I would say. They make an effort to, quote, simplify the rules by condensing rules together, which make them more confusing to tables that demand and want more precision, to cater to other tables that probably are ignoring many of these rules anyway. All right, my 5th and last point is that the martial caster divide is unaddressed in the new edition. Now you might be saying, objection! There actually has been something new added to martial characters, and that's true. They added weapon masteries, extra abilities and rider effects on your weapon attacks if you are a martial character and can unlock weapon masteries. And what I would say is that, yes, on the one hand, playing a martial is more interesting. There are more choices and meaning to which weapons you choose and which ones you use in any given turn. On the other hand, I would say that the power gap between martials and casters is largely the same. And if you have a table with optimizing caster players, the niche protection that existed for martials, they were the ones who do regular damage and didn't have to worry about daily resources. Protecting their niche has become less with the new edition. Now, much of the source of the martial caster disparity was in the design of spells, and we've seen under number 1 what they have done to spells. One thing I didn't talk about is that a lot of damage from spells has increased across the board, something that was more the martial's territory before. Another thing I didn't mention is that some spells are effectively summon martial character spells. Here is Giant Insect, a new spell in the new edition, 4th level spell that summons an insect that can last up to 10 minutes that can fight arguably better than a martial character of a similar level. Similar attack modifiers, similar damage, similar hit points. And they have this blockbuster effect of making a ranged attack up to 60 feet that does damage plus immobilizes the creature without a saving throw until the insect's next turn. There's no way for them to escape from this web that many monster web abilities do. So it does comparable damage and can shut down an enemy. Now the counter argument is that this uses a limited resource, but then that requires having a longer adventuring day, which many dungeon masters don't impose on their parties, either because it's too taxing on their mind or because they don't want to completely shut down the benefits of spells like Tiny Hut, which did get a patch but didn't really address the core problem of that spell in the new edition. But back to the argument that martials now have weapon masteries in the new edition. They've not only given martials weapon mastery, but they've also given them to casters in this game because of the level dip, because of how multi-classing works in D&D. They have strengthened level dipping now. Before, a wizard who took a level in fighter could get armor proficiency and martial weapon proficiency and better hit points. Now they can do that as well as gain weapon mastery, which is supposed to be the new defining toy that was supposed to boost martials closer to where casters are at. Now that wizard is rocking the marshal's new toy while having access to the shield spell, and unless their DM is taxing their daily resources, they basically have the marshal character's offensive and defensive, much of their ability, while rocking a full spell list. Now, I thought that the new edition early in the Unearthed Arcana process with article number 2, which came out nearly 2 years ago, I thought they were going to do some more niche protection when they announced the creation of class groups: experts, mages, priests, and warriors. I thought maybe there was going to be some exclusive abilities that some classes would get simply by virtue of being a part of that group that no other class can get via a level dip. But they never explained why they had these class groupings to the community while asking the playtesting community to give opinions on these groupings. And they also rescinded these groupings without explanation. And multi-classing is largely the same as what 3rd edition D&D introduced in the year 2000, 24 years ago, where you can take a level from a class and get most of their abilities from that level. A system that nearly every other RPG that focuses on tactical combat has moved away from. D&D 4e moved away from it. Pathfinder 2e moved away from it. Shadow of the Demon Lord moved away from it. 13th Age allows taking a level from another class, but it outright bars synergies of having abilities from both classes being used in the same action. And the reason is because design-wise, you have a real issue allowing 3E style multiclassing, this 24-year-old style of multiclassing, because how do you make every class feel strong and distinct as its class starting at level 1? How do you do that without preventing exploits? And 5E's solution was to spread out class features over the first 3 levels, but in order to make marshals feel included and powerful at level 1, they gave weapon masteries to marshals in this new edition, and also made it available, therefore, to caster characters to take with a single level. We also have another change in the new edition. Before, a spellcaster class usually had a mental ability score as their primary and highest score, and naturally would have a disadvantage fighting with weapons which require strength or dexterity. Previously, there was a very popular level dip called the Hexblade dip, having 1 level of Warlock, and being a Hexblade Warlock allowed you to use your Charisma modifier for your weapon attack and damage rolls. The change is that you now no longer need to take a level dip to use your main casting stat for weapon attacks. They have buffed the True Strike spell and made it a cantrip, and use your spellcasting ability modifier with a weapon for its attack and damage rolls. And on top of that, it scales at higher level. At level 5, you add a d6, and you have the choice of making your damage not physical, but radiant damage. So now you no longer have to slow down your spellcasting progression to take much of the weapon fighting ability of martial classes. You stay on par with them, at least until the marshals get extra attack, but that is compensated by the fact that your cantrip scales. Granted, you have no martial weapon proficiency or weapon mastery using this route, but your basic weapon fighting stats are comparable, and you have more versatility by being able to turn your damage into radiant damage. Now, what is it that the rules lawyer wants? I am not saying there should be Pathfinder 2e-like parity between marshals and casters. Maybe that's not desirable to the D&D audience. Casters were all-powerful in older editions of D&D, but at least in those editions, marshals had a way to deal with casters. They could beat up those nerds. And, okay, I'm a nerd myself. I'm not saying beat up nerds, but you know what I mean. Let's say I sympathize with the plight of martial characters, with the disadvantaged. Casters were weak. They had fewer hit points. They were vulnerable in the older editions. And once you got in their face, they just plain couldn't cast a spell while you were in their face. Or in 3rd edition, they could try, but you would hit them with an attack of opportunity and fuck them up and possibly disrupt their spell. But now you don't get reactions to disrupt their spell casting, at least not without a special ability. Now they can cast the shield spell to give themselves a +5 to AC for a round, or cast Misty Step and teleport away from you as a bonus action, Now they're more like slippery fighters who, after they get away, can slam you with a spell that targets your mental saves and make you charmed or frightened, or hypnotized, or put in a force cage. And it doesn't help that they say that all the old subclasses are legal and can be used with the new edition. Now, this commitment to backwards compatibility is something I've criticized. I did a video on it, I'll show the thumbnail, where I said that it introduces unexpected and undesirable interactions between the new and the old, and also the commitment to backwards compatibility limited the redesign process. It prevented innovations that I think, if they were to happen, the community would be thankful for. Here's an article from comicbook.com where they say specifically that, yes, you can use all these old subclasses, including the Blade Singer, a popular wizard subclass. That is the subclass who, for all the key fights in a day, can arguably out-martial a martial, while still having a full spellcasting progression. They get the twin bonus of improved weapon fighting, light armor proficiency, while being able to enter a special state called Blade Song, where they get a bonus to Constitution saving throws so that it's harder to disrupt those blockbuster control spells that they can have. They also get to use their intelligence modifier for weapon attacks and damage, and a unique intelligence bonus to their armor class. And at 6th level, they get an extra attack, just 1 level later than other martial characters, and one of those attacks can be a cantrip. With the new edition, this subclass is still legal, and now they can take a level of fighter to gain weapon mastery and combine this with their 2 attack. From the standpoint of a martial class, your new toy of weapon mastery has now just been taken up by the wizard. They now have access to Nick and Topple and the other weapon mastery abilities, and they can combine it with the True Strike cantrip, which you can't. And they've done this with a fraction of the investment you put into your martial skills. So we'll remember an important change in this new edition that they announced during the Unearthed Arcana period. They took away feats that allowed martial characters to accept a -5 penalty to their accuracy to get a +10 bonus to their damage. They took those away. What have they replaced them with? They replaced those with the weapon mastery options. These are supposed to compensate for that loss. Many speculated that bonus damage would still be available to martials through the base rules. We have not heard anything of the kind, and it would have been stated in the player's handbook. But the Marshal's new toy is now takeable by casters through a single level dip, which they no longer have to invest into Hexblade Warlock if they wanted to use their casting stat for their weapon attacks like they did before, because they now can just cast True Strike, which in addition scales upward, kind of reflecting a poor man's version of your extra attack. But they maintain some competitiveness with you in the weapon fighting department, while you're not competitive with them in the spellcasting department. And on top of that, if they are a Blade Singer wizard, they can combine weapon mastery with their scaling True Strike. Now, in the end, it's possible martials got a boost in the new edition because not everything is damage. The weapon masteries introduce important status effects. However, I think it can be said with confidence that this desire among many players who play martials to not be outclassed by casters has not been met. All right, so my final thoughts. Why did these issues crop up? To reiterate, they had a limited playtest. They were committed to saying that this is not a new edition, when the reality is that players and DMs want improvements, and all of the hype has been about changes to the game because there is a discontent about where the game is at right now. People want more choices for their characters, yes, and that's been addressed in much of the publicity by Wizards of the Coast, but people also want changes such as the change to the janky bonus action spellcasting rule. Martial characters want more power. DMs want to have a workable encounter building system or a workable magic item economy. They could have addressed some of these system-wide issues with surgical interventions into the current engine. They could have fixed the math behind saving throws. Or they could have revisited the bonus action system, which I did a video about. They never playtested. Their last playtest before the 2014 edition did not have bonus actions. And in my video, I suggested maybe they should look at 4E's exchangeable action economy that included standard actions and minor actions. But instead of such interventions, they put band-aids. And some of the band-aids that they put were on other band-aids that were placed because 5e made a lot of compromises between the old school and the new. And the band-aids that they put in place could have been placed better, and I attribute this to all of the firings that happened at Hasbro. They could have avoided the issues with spells I discussed in this video had they had a spells playtest, and all of these things would have been worked out. They said that they were going to have more playtests, but they didn't happen. They said that they would have a playtest for the Dungeon Master's Guide and another for the Monster Manual. Those didn't happen. Yeah, they playtested a subsystem of bastions for the DMG, but they didn't address the burning concerns of Dungeon Masters, including having prices for magic items, which again, third-party companies have done within the 5e framework. But there's a third issue I haven't addressed yet, which I also attribute to their management, which is who were they thinking about when revising the game? I'm about to play a clip of an interview of Jeremy Crawford about the new spells in the player's handbook, where he makes a bizarre statement. And I'm going to play it and see if you can catch the issue before I explain it. By the way, I attribute this finding to a member of my Discord who is a giant within the Pathfinder subreddit community, AAA Battery. I thank them for sharing this with me. All right, here it is.
We've also made it so that some spells that were really painful to cast in terms of their action economy are far less painful. I think one of the prime examples of that is Produce Flame, the Druid cantrip. That cantrip was really painful to set up. Like, once you got it going, it could be fun to hurl the fire. Now it is way easier to cast it. And that is actually, funnily enough, another one where it was not only painful to cast in the tabletop game, but when I was playing Baldur's Gate 3, was excruciating to cast in Baldur's Gate 3. And it was actually while playing Baldur's Gate 3, I thought, we are going to redesign Produce Flame so that it will not be, there will not be this much friction to cast this cantrip.
From his description, it sounded like you had to spend some kind of action, an action or a bonus action, to set up Produce Flame, and then use another kind of action to fire Produce Flame. But when we look at Produce Flame from before, the 2014 version, it doesn't do that. When you cast it with an action, you can actually hurl the flame as part of casting the spell. It says, when you cast the spell, or as an action on a later turn, you can hurl the flame at a creature. This cantrip has a dual use. It can illuminate the area and act like a torch, and when you attack with it, it ends the spell. So what he's talking about isn't a problem in the tabletop game. You just use an action to fire with this cantrip. No muss, no fuss. What he's talking about is when you play Baldur's Gate 3 and click Produce Flame, because it has two potential uses, a UI pops up that lets you fire off the spell. And because that ends the spell, you have to cast Produce Flame again and deal with that UI pop-up again.
When I was playing Baldur's Gate 3, was excruciating to cast in Baldur's Gate 3.
Now, how have they changed it? Well, I'm going to assume it's unchanged from the last playtest it appeared in from last October. I've seen no news about this, so I assume it's the same. This lets you cast Produce Flame as a bonus action. It lasts 10 minutes, and when you attack with it, it does not end the spell. So for Baldur's Gate 3, if this were in the video game, this is more convenient. You don't have to deal with that UI pop-up every single time you attack a foe, because you don't have to recast it. However, it arguably introduces new problems. Maybe you don't want to have light giving away the location of your party, in which case you'd have to use a bonus action to activate this before using your action to fire it. So actually introducing the problem that it sounded like he was trying to avoid, which actually was more of a UI issue and had nothing to do with the tabletop D&D experience. What's apparent is that he decided this spell needed to be changed because of his experience with it playing Baldur's Gate 3.
And it was actually while playing Baldur's Gate 3, I thought, we are going to redesign Produce Flame. so
Similarly, there's a spell that's considered strong called Hypnotic Pattern, which over a minute, possibly, if you can maintain your concentration, can charm a group of foes within a 30-foot cube, a huge area. It also incapacitates them and reduces their speed to 0, so they can't really do anything until you bring them into the fight by attacking them. Very strong spell. Baldur's Gate 3, they've nerfed the spell to last only 2 rounds at most, so it's not considered strong in the meta of Baldur's Gate 3. This spell has not been addressed in the revision. I think part of that is because in Baldur's Gate 3, it's not seen as a problem in that game. What I'm saying here is that one gets the sense that they put more thought into the experience of Baldur's Gate 3 players than they put into the experience of dungeon masters and players who've been playing their tabletop game for the past 10 years. Despite the fact that they had the opportunity of a playtest for the last 2 years. So their design process was informed by the priority from management to make the game more enjoyable to video gamers. One gets the sense that they are seeing at some point in the future the default way to play this game is through their 3D virtual tabletop. They see the potential market and the number of players that could be in the virtual tabletop as dwarfing the size of the current D&D player base. And this dovetails with my point about not caring about human dungeon masters. It's been pretty open, and I've been saying this for a while, that their playtest process starting 2 years ago was very player focused and focused on making the game more enticing and exciting for players, to the detriment to dungeon masters who their challenge of providing challenging encounters is increased with players having more abilities that can defeat their enemies. I think they're caring less about dungeon masters, human dungeon masters at least, because they see us as replaceable. And I was not alone in predicting, along with some other content creators, that they will be looking into artificial intelligence DMs to run their D&D virtual tabletop. I pointed out how their own statements to their shareholders said they want to create a recurrent spending environment and prioritize not just dungeon masters, who currently make up only 20% of their audience, but monetize the rest of the players at the table. They want to explode the size of the D&D player base, but they see the requirement of a human DM, that brain that needs to manage the wants and desires and antics of a group of people. They see that as a limitation to the explosive growth they see of players in their game. If they can make their virtual tabletop the dungeon master, then they can remove that artificial cap in their eyes on their game's growth. So it should be no surprise that on July 26th, I'm recording this on August 7th, that Hasbro CEO Chris Cox said that we are, quote, going all in on becoming a digital play company. They announced earlier this year a $1 billion investment in internal game development. They want to have their own Baldur's Gate 3, basically. And this is in the article right after saying they had nearly 2,000 layoffs last year. It's clear that they're shifting their priorities from game design towards creating video games. Then on August 4th, they announced a new position for a principal AI engineer. They advertised that they're the company that brings genre-defining games like Magic the Gathering and Dungeons & Dragons, and they want an engineer to partner with the technical director to ensure all of the products at WOTC are supported by our engineering efforts, AI engineering efforts. They will explore new uses of AI for all levels of game development, and included among what they want to create is intelligent generation of text dialogue, audio, art assets, and NPC behaviors and real-time bot frameworks. This is undeniably creating an artificial intelligence DM. They now can solve the problem of everyone getting together for an RPG game. You don't even need the DM. You can just log in, roleplay, and interact with intelligent generation of NPC behaviors. If Carl the Fighter didn't show up, you can interact with intelligently generated Carl. They also want AI to do 2D and 3D content creation and audio generation. Now, to be clear, I don't have a blanket opposition to all artificial intelligence. You can see my position in that video. It is possible for there to be AI that is useful for the dungeon masters, who, again, I am the partisan for. For example, it would be great to be able to say, oh, I'd like to have a dungeon with the XYZ feature, or a cozy tavern that has a second floor inn. That seems like one good use of AI in the future in tabletop RPGs. So long as they don't steal art or displace workers, which I also go over in that video. What I'm actually against is what they're clearly doing here. They're overusing it. They're seeing dungeon masters, human dungeon masters, as replaceable. The people who run the game, as Sly Flourish said, who put in their time and money and commitment, are not the people they're designing the game for. They're designing this game for the players, current and future players, that they can monetize. Now, all of these rules, hiccups, and issues that I brought up in this video, what's the future for them? There are two possible futures, and they're both problematic. Scenario one is that they do not address these issues for a number of years, like a number of issues in the 2014 Player's Handbook that were screaming for revision, like the bonus action spellcasting rule, 4 years. And other issues where the designers intended one thing and the rules as written did not comport with that, such as this tweet from Jeremy Crawford saying that the rules for damage from multiple magic missiles don't reflect their intent. Other companies that make tabletop role-playing games, when they make mistakes or there's a gulf between what they intended and the written rule, correct them. They do an errata. But Wizards of the Coast let all of these issues continue and postponed obvious fixes and changes until they made a new edition that everyone has to buy. So that's one scenario that's undesirable. That didn't have to happen because they could have play tested and made a more serious effort to revise their game. The other scenario, unfortunately, is also undesirable because of who we know Hasbro is. And that is they correct the rules and make desired improvements that people want, but that immediately obsoletes all of the physical books that people have in their hands right now. And people realize, maybe at first or maybe after a number of rules updates and improvements, remember they're saying there's no additions, there's just D&D, that it's better to just buy the digital version of the game because they can always update it on their D&D Beyond website. And there's precedent for this. D&D 4th edition had physical books that were immediately made more and more obsolete because they treated it like an MMO. They had new improvements, yes, and corrections, but they were so frequent and happening so often that you were much better off just subscribing to D&D Insider and having your character builder always up to date with the latest versions of your powers and classes and so forth. Now, this is not 4th edition. It's not nearly as crunchy. However, if they make future improvements that are, on the one hand, needed for the game, that would improve the game, they would be also simultaneously acclimating the market to prefer digital copies, D&D Beyond copies of Dungeons & Dragons. Okay, as an aside, I'm going to point out, constantly improving your game is desirable, but it doesn't have to be exploitative. There are companies that put out their rules for free, including improved versions of those rules, or sell PDFs. That's every single other TTRPG company that is not Wizards of the Coast. They sell PDFs that you can get updated versions of if they update those PDFs. So why get people hooked to digital? Because you can charge them for access. You can charge people for access to something you don't own a copy of. And already, if you own a copy of the new rules at D&D Beyond, you are not able to share that with your players if you're the Dungeon Master without subscribing to their Master Tier subscription. It's actually not as pricey as I thought it would be. It's $55 a year, which in some countries that is a lot, but at least in developed countries that's less than what it could be. However, Wizards has to be on its best behavior right now because an edition change is the most precarious time for the company. people are looking at other options, weighing the pros and cons of switching to another system rather than having to update to a new system and buy new books and so forth. And it's pretty clear that they plan to find ways to aggressively monetize D&D Beyond. And this is a new position that they announced on July 24th for a monetization designer. For Dungeons & Dragons Digital, they call it. This person will bring at least 2 years on a live service game. Now, what exactly that is, whether it's the 3D virtual tabletop or access to the tabletop rules themselves, we don't know. But we see they're already trying to monetize non-3D VTT players with their exclusive pre-order bonuses, where you can, if you pre-order, you can get early access to the rules and a Gold Dragon digital mini for free, which they, of course, will charge for later, and digital dice sets, frames, and backdrops. And to get the entire everything, you need to pay for the full amount, including pre-ordering books that including the Monster Manual that releases in February of next year. Already, Wizards of the Coast is mirroring practices in the video game industry in how they are rolling out their tabletop RPG rules, which they see being ultimately a video game in the future, possibly run by a human DM, but a video game. And one of the practices of the video game industry is to put out a booky product, plan improvements for later, while applying psychological pressure to customers to pre-order before they see how buggy the game is. You might be disappointed by what you see on launch day, but hell, you already paid the money, you put in a sunk cost. Might as well not lose that investment by moving on to a different game. For consumers, the course of action we should take, I think, is what people are already saying with regard to video games. Don't pre-order. Don't reward predatory practices. Don't buy sight unseen. Don't let them take your loyalty for granted. Let them earn it. Research other alternatives before you jump in, and I'll point people to my video where I compare the cost of continuing D&D to Pathfinder and other RPGs. But I also point you to other creators who cover a wide variety of excellent tabletop games that serve different goals and what people look for in role-playing games. There isn't any one system that delivers everything that role-playing games can potentially offer. And heck, looking at other systems and how they do things will make you a better DM and player. So that's it. So I hope you support me, like this video, and also subscribe and ring the bell. I'll have links in my video description to playlists of videos of me covering the new Dungeons & Dragons. I had videos called a Lawyer's Critique series is what I called it, where I critiqued the new rules that they were putting out during the playtest period. And also videos I have done following Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast. I also helped break the OGL scandal before it got into mainstream gaming press. And also support my Patreon. It allows me to continue this channel. I don't earn money as a social justice pro bono lawyer. It gives you ad-free early access to most of my videos and exclusive content. And also join my Discord, where we talk about Pathfinder 2e, the new D&D edition, and other gaming. And you can also play Pathfinder 2e through our free drop-in, drop-out organized play system called Endless Tale Tavern. So that's it. I've been Ronald the Rules Lawyer. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you next time.